Good evening and welcome to our Midweek Bible study this evening. This is Dr. Branch, our interim pastor here at Emmanuel Baptist, and I'm associate pastor here at Walter Basic. It is great to have you with us this evening. We apologize for the technical difficulties, but Lord willing, we are online both on YouTube and on Facebook Live. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Christian view of war. Dr. Branch is an ethicist at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and so he has a bit of experience with that. And as well is also been a military chaplain at Midwestern Baptist.
So for the veterans that might be watching, I was based at Arifjan, which is somewhat like being at Disney World in the Middle East. It's as far as Army bases go, it's pretty nice. It's the largest military base in the Middle East the United States has. It's in Kuwait. But we were doing missions in and out of Iraq. These would last about a week at a time. I would ride with my soldiers around Iraq. We were picking up the implements of war and bringing them back to Kuwait. So I was mostly in southeastern Kuwait on these, southeastern Iraq on these missions. Then the second half, that was in the fall of 2011. So we finished the responsible drawdown of equipment and material out of Iraq in December of 2011. In the winter and spring of 2012, I think the number was 284 of my soldiers. I had a very large battalion, about 1,300 soldiers. So about 284 of them went to Afghanistan on 90-day orders. And they were all over Afghanistan. The largest group we had over there was a platoon that was running gun trucks between Bagram and Mazar al-Sharif up north. And they had to travel a very treacherous road on a regular basis. But I had soldiers all over Afghanistan. I spent some time, I wasn't there for forever, but I was in Afghanistan for a short period of time, flying all over the place in Afghanistan, visiting my soldiers at these various bases. So I was at Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan all on one tour. We also had 4 Army boats assigned to us. People may not know this, the United States Army actually has ocean-going vessels. And so we had 4 boats, and they were running missions between Kuwait and Qatar, and they're carrying things down to Qatar. Some people call it Qatar. Carrying things down there, and so we actually had Army boats as well. It was a big battalion, it was a big task, but I was honored to do it. And I didn't have it nearly as hard as a lot of our veterans have out of Gulf War II.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that with us. I mean, it's good to not only have your ethical background, but also that this is a personal thing for you too. It's not just an ethical dilemma. You've actually been there. You've actually seen it.
Right. So I have a bias when it comes to the Christian and war, but I think this is a good time to talk about it because where we're at in the book of Isaiah.
Yes.
So there's some of these passages, of course, I can't touch on Sunday morning. 66 chapters in Isaiah, and I'm preaching 12 sermons unless Dr. McAlpin gets back sooner, which we certainly hope for and pray for. But there's a passage in Isaiah chapter 2, and it says this, Isaiah 2:4, that talks about beating swords into plowshares, and it's a great promise of peace, but it's sometimes taken out of context. It says this, Isaiah chapter 2, verse Yahweh will judge between the nations, and he will render decisions for many peoples. And they will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. So that verse is very interesting. It actually pops up at a city park in New York, which is directly across from the United Nations. This park was built in 1948, about the time the United Nations was being established in New York. And it has the second half of Isaiah 2:4. And so it's interesting, when you go to the park there right across the United Nations, it has on the wall this quote, and it starts with halfway through verse 4, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares, and it goes on to the end. But what they leave off is the first 2 lines, and that gives you your context. This is about God's final judgment.
Right.
Now, I'm premillennial. I suspect, I can't prove that some of the things that you read in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 are actually millennial. That when Christ is reigning and ruling on the earth, it talks about the word of the Lord going out from Zion, the mountain of the Lord reigning over the earth. I suspect that's millennial. I can't absolutely prove that, but I think that's what's going to happen when Christ reigns and rules, Revelation 20, 1,000 years here on earth. But the point being for tonight, what everyone needs to remember is the second half of Isaiah 2:4 gets kind of turned into a humanistic motto for a lot of people. Oh, well, we as humans can usher in this world of perfect peace, and we're all going to do this. And the fact that that second half of the verse is right across from the United Nations kind of communicates that humanistic, optimistic ideal. Well, we as humans can end all these wars and we can usher in perfect peace, and we're going to do it. But they leave out the context, which is this all occurs at God's judgment. This occurs when God takes over. It's not actually something that occurs through human power. So this verse from Isaiah chapter 2 gives us a good springboard into the topic of the Christian and war.
Gotcha. So you would maybe describe your understanding of the view of war really as one of realism with human sin, really having to factor that into the whole picture.
Well, most people, I advocate what's called just war theory, and almost all just war advocates do.
Right.
It's none of us prefer war. If you've ever been to war, you don't want to go back.
Right.
No one who's been to war wants to go back. No one who's been to war wants other people to have to go to war.
Right.
But we live in a world where you have sinful humans that do bad things.
Okay.
And from a Christian realist approach, you're basically dealing with the fact that if someone doesn't stop these bad people from doing bad things, lots of other bad things will happen.
Yeah. Well, that leads right to the first question. So, is war ever morally acceptable? And if so, under what conditions?
Right. Well, I believe so.
Yeah.
And there are several criteria for a just war, but I will give two that I think are very helpful for tonight. First of all, war needs to be fought for a just cause. And sometimes I joke with my students that when we say war should be fought for a just cause, unfortunately too many nations have gone to war just cause, just because they want to go to war.
Right. Yes.
That's not what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there have been too many wars, and there have been wars that have been fought for foolish reasons, for just nationalistic pride, or even sometimes in years past some egotistical leader just wants to prove his power or her power. So there's been all sorts of wrong reasons. But a just cause is something like what happened in Kuwait, for example, in 1990 when the Iraqi forces invaded. They violated national boundaries of a recognized nation that had done nothing against them other than loan them lots of money. That was the main reason Saddam went there, is because he owed the Kuwaitis a lot of money. He didn't want to pay it back. So this is a violation of national sovereignty of a duly recognized nation. It's a member of the United Nations. So the goal in 1991 in Gulf War was to restore the boundaries of a recognized nation. That's the goal. And we're going to push the enemy out. So you have to have a just cause like that. Or, for example, you might have a rampaging nation like Imperial Japan in the late 30s. Many people forget that World War II actually starts in 37 with Japan's attacking China. They already attacked Manchuria, which was part of China, but typically most people think of 37, the rape of Nanking, all these horrible things. So you have this nation marching across and destroying all these other nations. Nazi Germany, the same thing. So that's the sort of thing that might qualify as a just cause. But the other criteria I would ask people to keep in mind is last resort. Too often nations run to war as the first option, and it really should be our last option. We should try everything first. Sometimes I get frustrated when I hear politicians from the right and the left, it doesn't matter, either side, that as soon as something goes on, they immediately start talking about putting boots on the ground. On the ground somewhere, you really don't want to do that unless you absolutely have to.
Right.
So it's when the things were breaking out in Syria and ISIS is certainly evil, they need to be stopped. But almost immediately the first option everybody was saying, well, let's put boots on the ground in Syria. Let me tell you, no one wanted to go to Syria. Right. Because the motto over there is me against my brother, me and my brother against the world, right? So we're going to fight each other till you show up, and then we're going to turn on you. So thankfully, calmer heads prevailed. We did have some advisors in there helping and some airstrikes coming in. But calmer heads prevailed, and we were able to enable other forces that were already there to execute the mission against ISIS. But I'm just saying that war needs to be the last resort. Mm-hmm. Too often it's the first resort. You need to try other options to see if they can work. Mm-hmm. So those are two criteria for going into a just war. Those are others, but I think those are the two most important.
Well, thank you for that. Well, some folks would take what you just said and look at Christ's words in Matthew 5, verses 38 through 39 and go, Jesus says turn the other cheek. And if he said that, shouldn't that be a case of pacifism?
Well, first of all, I want to say I respect my pacifist brothers. I really do. And in fact, the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 doesn't actually take a position on just war. It seems to advocate its strong advocacy of government. It seems to advocate a stance that you could be a pacifist or a just war theorist and be a Southern Baptist. I think that's true. Most Southern Baptists are just war folks, most are, and that includes myself. So I respect my pacifist brothers, and I would like everyone to understand their position doesn't emerge from nowhere. There are reasons why they land where they do. First of all, it's just the violence and nastiness of war. It's a horrible thing to see human bodies dismembered and people, the pain of war. And we go to war for national reasons, but when you get in the trenches, when you're in a ditch and the rounds are coming in, nobody's thinking about the great cause that got you there. You're thinking about the guy or the fellow soldier, male or female, whoever they may be beside you. You're fighting for them. You're not fighting for the great cause. But this is a violent thing, and to see people that you really care about die or to lose a limb, it's disorienting. So our pacifist friends are right to point to the horror of war. When they come to these passages like Matthew 5, here's what the Lord says. He's talking in the Sermon on the Mount. He's turning everything on its head. He's correcting some wrong ideas about the Old Testament. But he says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. So my pacifist friends will say, aha, this is a case study number one for why we shouldn't go to war. Jesus says, turn the other cheek. But really what Jesus is talking about is interpersonal shame. So let me try to explain. Read carefully what he says. Do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. So in that context, to slap someone on the right cheek, if you're using the right hand, that's this. Yes. It's popping them on the cheek. It's an insult, and you're trying to get them to bring some response out. Mm-hmm. To slap someone with the left hand on the right cheek is even greater insult. And I don't mean to be crude, but in that culture, when people went to the toilet, that was the hand they used. Right. So you're striking someone with this hand that you use in a very intimate, personal way in the toilet. It's an insult. So this is about interpersonal shame that Christ is dealing with. He's not really addressing a situation like an armed intruder breaking into my home attempting to harm my wife, Lisa. Right. If we take it one step further, he's not really dealing with a situation where a peaceful country is invaded. You're Poland in 1939 and the Nazi tanks come rolling across the frontier. That's not what he's talking about here. Right. So I give strong pushback to my pacifist friends. I just don't think that they're rightly emphasizing the context of what Christ is saying here. Now let me just say, if I'm witnessing on the streets of Kansas City here, let's say I'm at a bus stop handing out tracts or Gospel Johns after the COVID crisis is over and we're back to doing those things, and someone spits on me or slaps me in the face or strikes me for being a Christian, the right response is to turn the other cheek in that environment, right, where someone's assaulting us for our Christian faith. But Christ is not talking here about a violent event when someone's striking or trying to kill an innocent person.
Gotcha. Very good. Thank you. With war, especially in the modern era, much has changed, particularly as it regards weaponry. Back hundreds of years prior to our era. But in today's thought process, we have things like weapons of mass destruction that are on the table for war in a lot of situations. Is it ever morally acceptable for a government to use such things?
Right, that's a big question because the only nation to ever use nuclear weapons on another country is the United States of America, and I love the United States. I mean, if you cut me, I bleed red, white, and blue, and I like John Wayne, and so... Right. But one of the rules for engaging in a just war, there's a set of rules for whether or not you go into war, and then once you make that choice, there's a set of rules for how you conduct yourself. And the goal is that it's the law of war. And so we're trying to put our soldiers in a position that they can come home with honor. That's what we want. We want our soldiers to come home with honor and a conscience. There's always going to be things that bother your conscience when you get into a combat situation. But we want to put our soldiers in a situation where they can carry themselves with honor when they come home, and they can have a clean conscience knowing they had to do a brutal duty, but they did it with honor. So part of that is you discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Right. And you don't kill civilians. Now, we often deal with an enemy that doesn't play by those rules. So do you remember the Black Hawk Down story from 1993, Battle of Mogadishu? Right. So some of these Somali warriors were out there and they were polygamists, and they bring their women with them, and they're in a gunfight with the Army Rangers. And some of these guys would place one wife in front of them, she's standing up, and he's shooting between her legs, and he'd place another wife on his back. And so he's using his wives. This happened several times. They're using their wives as human shields. None of those young men in that Ranger battalion went over there to shoot an unarmed woman. Right. So we're dealing with an enemy that does not play by these rules. They have a crusade mentality, which is completely different. But when it comes to weapons of mass destruction, it's hard to see how their use can really be justified when you look at the way that civilians are killed. Hiroshima was spared from the bombing campaign with B-29s. The firebombing of Tokyo, probably more people died in the firebombing of Tokyo than on Hiroshima. We'll say that there was some effort to warn the Japanese populace that these things were coming. I don't know how. There's debates about how intense and effective that was. But the fact is, we're the only nation to have dropped those bombs. I will tell you, there's what's often forgotten from that war in particular is what was called a kill order. I forget the numbers. Well, I want to say somewhere 100,000, but the listeners would have to check me out on the data on this. But we have a lot of prisoner of war in Japan. Most famous, Louis Zamperini, Unbroken. Right. He's there. Right. So the word was the Japanese military put out the order. As soon as we put boots on the ground on a beach on the Japanese homeland, they're going to execute all these prisoners. Mm. So part of the reason that Truman wanted to end the war had to do with we didn't want our prisoners to get killed. It also had to do with geopolitics. Russia had invaded northern Japan, and we didn't want to see Japan turn into a Russian puppet state like was happening in Eastern Europe. So there's a lot going on there. My dad actually served under Colonel Paul Tibbets when he was in the Air Force. He's a commander of a base where he's at. Paul Tibbets never had one thought. He was always convinced he did the right thing. He's the pilot of the Enola Gay that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. But it's hard to see how those things fit with separating combatants from non-combatants. It's really, really difficult. Some people talked about the tactical use of nuclear weapons. Man, anytime you start bringing nuclear weapons, you've gone from tactical to strategic immediately. Right. So I know that we still have thousands of nuclear weapons in the world, right, and several nuclear capable countries. It's still a frightening thing.
Very good, very good. So we're going to kind of shift gears. We kind of discussed some of the ethical dilemmas, and now from a Christian perspective, right, we want to kind of provide our folks with how to think about military servicemen and women, because in generations previous there was a draft, and there was a lot more people who experienced war, had that common experience, or at least had a relative, whereas now you really don't have as many in the military.
Less than 1% of the people ever served. A couple of years back, when I was overseas, they had this Occupy Wall Street crowd. All these people need to go get a job. But anyway, they're occupying Wall Street. And they're calling themselves the 1%ers. And I'll tell you, no, I was with the real 1%ers, the less than 1% that ever served. Right. And let me say a couple of things that, for me, one of the reasons I'm not a pacifist as well, I'll just tell you, there's a passage, it's Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. It's the definitive passage regarding how a Christian relates with government. I should have told you this earlier when we were talking beforehand. Mm-hmm. But in this passage, Paul talks about the right of government to use deadly force. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. It's because of human sinfulness. He says in Romans 13, verse 3, "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. If you want to have no fear of authority, do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good." So basically, if you don't want to be afraid of the state patrolman, don't break the speed limit, right? Right. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. Right. That's the sword. Now, he uses a Greek word, but most likely referring to the Roman gladius, which changed over time. But this is a sword carried by the Roman soldier. This is a lethal weapon. Right. So Paul is affirming the right of government to use lethal force to protect its citizens. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So Paul is talking about a civil situation, but it's certainly true that if a government has a right to use lethal force to enforce civil laws, Every time our men and women in law enforcement put on that Glock 40 caliber and they walk out the door, they're fulfilling what Paul says right here.
Right.
It does not bear the sword in vain. Why is that? Human sinfulness. Man is depraved, and the heart of man is desperately wicked, and people do evil things to other people, and you have to have someone to use force to stop them. This also ties in, actually, I'll just say, I've never met or encountered a pacifist argument that I really feel handles Romans 13, 1 through 7 in a robust manner. So that's one of the reasons I'm not. But what I was going to drive at is to say that God empowers government to use that force also means that government has a responsibility to hold that God-given right to use deadly force with great caution.
Yes.
Great caution, because of course there's been tyrannical governments that have done horrible things. It's interesting, John Calvin said it's better to live under a bad prince than no prince at all. And what he meant by that is bad government's better than no government. I agree.
Right.
So even if you have this horrible government, that's better than living under anarchy. You can just break down into kind of warlord rule, which nobody wants.
Right.
The other thing I would say is in the New Testament, there are several occasions where Roman soldiers come to faith in Christ. None of them are asked to leave the Roman army. And even before the time of Christ, when Roman soldiers come to John the Baptist, what should we do? He starts saying treat people ethically. He doesn't say leave the Roman army.
Right.
And so Roman centurion, Christ doesn't tell him to leave. By the way, it's a soldier that first confesses Christ as the Son of God after the crucifixion, right there at the cross. Surely this was the Son of God. It's very interesting. Acts chapter 10, Cornelius, he's not asked to leave the army. So I think there's a capability for someone to serve with great honor and nobility in the military. I mean, I was in a non-combatant role, but obviously I believe that to be true.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, maybe you can fill me in, did we have any soldiers out of this church deployed recently? I'm still kind of new here.
Not in the recent past, but yes, we've had folks who served in our church for, we've had quite a few actually. We even have a World War II vet still alive here.
Wow, right.
So we've had quite a good history of folks, and we love them, we appreciate what they've done, but something that I think is very common for each of us who have not been in military service is how do we minister to them? How do we deal with folks in a way that's loving and compassionate?
So I'm going to clear away some brush and just say the first thing that you don't want to do is never ever ask a veteran, did you kill anyone? That is the least appreciated question any veteran ever gets. No veteran wants to be asked that question. But it seems that somehow people who've never served almost have this sort of grim fascination with that.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you that when someone goes overseas, what they want to know is you're going to take care of their family. So the first thing is, if that soldier, whoever he or she is, when they are overseas, that soldier's overseas, they want to know if the church is going to watch after their family while they're gone. When I was overseas, I had a couple of friends of mine that helped me out. One time, my daughter Annabeth had given her a little necklace. She dropped it down the sink in her bathroom, and it got stuck in the P-trap, and she was just distraught because I'm over in the Middle East and I'd given her this before I left. So a friend, Jacob Albert, came over as a member of Lenexa Baptist, and he got it out of the P-trap for her. Man, I'd take a bullet for that guy. That meant so much to my family. There was one time the shower in our master bathroom, for some reason, started leaking coming through the garage, and Lisa didn't know what to do, and my friend Brian Rothrock came over and fixed that while I was overseas. You know, you really just take that so appreciatively. Mm-hmm. It's things like that. But one of the things I would say is, it's what's called, Dave Grossman is a man who's written a lot on the experience of combat, and he's on everyone's reading list in the military. Dave Grossman, 2 books on combat, on killing. And he uses an analogy that I think is very helpful for the church to think about when you think about people in the military. It's a sheepdog analogy. So here's what he means by that. Everybody likes having a sheepdog around when the wolf is around, because the sheepdog's got a mean streak in him or her, and the sheepdog's not afraid to get out there and tangle it up with the wolf. And when the wolf is around, everybody's really glad that the sheepdog is there. Now, when the wolf leaves, nobody knows what to do with the sheepdog, because he or she still got that same mean streak in them. And I think God put it there. Well, people in the military are the sheepdog. Law enforcement, they're the sheepdog. And they're not afraid to go tangle it up with some really bad people. And they're the people that run to the sound of fire. Well, if you're going to minister to people like that, you have to realize they're going to laugh at things you don't laugh at, you don't think are funny. They're going to be rough around the edges. There's going to be some coarseness to them. But you have to love them where they are at and meet them where they're at and be very, very patient with them. There was a soldier, and I was doing a Bible study at one spot. I had them going on in several different places, but I was doing Bible study at one spot. The soldier was using profanity in Bible study. He just kept using profanity. And you've never had Bible study until you've had people use extreme profanity in Bible study. But the Lord really pierced my heart and said, just be patient with him. Be patient. And so, I know it's going to sound strange, but I didn't tell him to stop. And about 3 or 4 months in the Bible study, he stopped by my office one day. He was at another little post off of our base over at the Kuwaiti Naval Base. And he came over to my office and he said, I wanted to talk to you without any of the rest of the guys around. And he started telling me his life story. The guy had been a bouncer in a bar and all these sort of things. He's a tough guy. And he just told me his life story. Man, he needed Christ. And we talked for about an hour and a half. He didn't come to Christ that day, but we talked about an hour and a half about what it means to follow Christ, where he's been, how God has a purpose and plan for his life. It was really one of the happiest witnessing opportunities I've had in my life. We got done after talking. He said, Chaplain, it's been so good to talk to you. I enjoyed this so much. I want you to know, if there's anything I can ever do for you, you just let me know. And I said, well, Specialist, there is one thing you could do. And it was quiet for a second. It was this long, pregnant pause. He said, yeah, I know. I need to quit cussing in Bible study. And he did. But you know what I'm saying? You just have to meet them where they're at. And so that's what I would tell the church. You also have to understand, for some people, the experience of combat is so traumatizing. People talk about PTSD. I don't even know if PTSD describes it. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. There was a neighbor of mine, he's a World War II vet. He died a couple of years ago. Man, Mr. Harold was a great guy. Man, he's just the best. He was an infantry in the United States Army in World War II. March 1945, he and a buddy walking down the road in Germany. A German 88 millimeter round comes in. Every veteran of World War II I ever talked to that heard that weapon said it made a distinctive sound. You knew it when it was coming. So this 88 millimeter rounds come in. Mr. Harold said, I jumped in the ditch on one side of the road. My buddy jumped in the ditch on the other side of the road. Round went off in the middle of the road. He said, I laid there for a second in this ditch, letting the concussion pass. He said, I realized, okay, I didn't die. And he said, and I popped up, and my best friend had a piece of shrapnel to his head. He's dead. And it was 70 years after that event. 70 years after that event. And Mr. Harold and I sitting under an oak tree. And he said, I still don't understand. He's a Christian. He was a devout Methodist. He loved the Lord. He said, I still don't know why God let me live and he let my friend die. And that's 70 years later, he's carrying that with him. The nightmares that men carry with them, men and women in combat. This is real. There's a movie, Flag of Our Fathers, and it's about Iwo Jima, and it starts out with this man having a nightmare in his bed, and he's calling out his friend's name, and it's a senior adult couple, and his wife reaches over and hugs him and lays him down. And I'm going to tell you that stuff's true. Soldiers deal with that. They carry it with them for forever, and to know that there's an extreme cost for our freedom. So that's why I stand up for the national anthem. I get kind of ticked off at people that don't. So
Well, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to look at Facebook.
I went from explaining this, and I went to
that's
commentary
okay.
on social commentary.
No, that's quite all right. I'm going to look at Facebook and see if there's any questions. Jason's going to look at YouTube. If you would, though, for the audience here, would you recommend any resources that folks could read into if they want to know a little bit more about?
Yeah, if you want to know what combat's like, you need to read Dave Grossman on combat and on killing. He's a first-rate scholar. He's a Christian. Talk about being rough around the edges. He is, but he is a Christian. And I've met him, and I respect him immensely. So, On Combat and On Killing by Dave Grossman. The other thing I would say very quickly, a lot of soldiers, the only version of the Bible which they're familiar is King James, and it translates the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, which is not a wrong translation. It's just not as specific as it should be. And it's, the modern translations say, "Thou shalt not murder." That's actually quite liberating for a lot of soldiers when they realize that it's not just "Thou shalt not kill," but it's "Thou shalt not murder," as in killing innocent life, and that does ease the conscience some for folks who've actually had to take life in combat.
Gotcha. Let me see here. Jason, do we have any questions at all? Are we good?
I actually had a question. You were talking about how that, thou shalt not kill. Is that something that comes more from the language barrier and how that's broken down? And
well, it's just the verb is ratzah. The verb ratzah, to give you an example how that verb is used, the same verb in the Sixth Commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," ratzah, is used to describe what happened to Naboth when Ahab killed him, trying to get Naboth's vineyard. So it's killing an innocent life. So the Sixth Commandment is the sanctity of innocent human life. And the Sixth Commandment, when it says, "Thou shalt not murder," I believe, this is my personal opinion, there are Christians who disagree with what I'm about to say. I believe the Bible allows the taking of human life in the cases of just war, self-defense, and then execution by legitimate state authority. Now, there are Christians who disagree with one or all three of those, or whatever, but the verb is ratzah. So kill is not a wrong translation, it's just not as precise as you would hope it would be. The other thing that I would say is when soldiers come home is try to treat soldiers with dignity, and you have to understand if they get some pushback, it was very disorienting for me. My wife and I have a wonderful marriage. We were married for 31 years, and we're extremely happy. We love each other very much. It was extremely disorienting. The toughest year of our life was the year when I was overseas. Toughest year of our marriage. And so Lisa's watching the TV. I would say, send an email, "Can't talk for a while." What that means is I'm going into a hot place, right?
Right.
And so she's watching the news, kind of, okay, is anybody, any KIAs over there today? And so the spouse is left back home carrying an emotional burden. It was hard on my daughters because, we had a happy family, and so suddenly Daddy's gone for a year. And they're not happy about that. They're kind of ticked off. Why's my dad got to go? Now the rest of these dads are going, right?
Right.
So just to have compassion for the families. And military families, I would say this as well. The biggest difference between the military today and the general populace, and I would say especially Johnson County, Kansas, just to be blunt, it's not ethnic, it's socioeconomic. It's largely blue-collar men and women that are fighting the wars for. And that's not always true. They're honorable people from wealthy families. We all understand that. But by and large, that's what it is. And I just encourage folks to keep in mind, if you're going to reach out to military personnel and share the gospel with them, you got to be patient. They've got that sheepdog mentality. They're going to be rough around the edges. Just take them where they are. Meet them where they're at. And I will tell you this, if a soldier ever figures out that you're somebody that can be trusted, you have a friend for life. But if they think you're a liar, you just lost it. There's nothing you can do. And so to always be a person of extreme truth and honor in your interactions with veterans.
If y'all have questions after you see this video later on, feel free to text us. Again, it's 913-270-1947. If you would like us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and subscribe on YouTube, we'd love to have you be part of that. We're going to have a service on Sunday morning at 10:45 with Dr. Branch bringing a message from the book of Isaiah. We'd love for you to be part of that. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great night.